Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Bland. I'm the director of the Asia Pacific program here at Chatham House. Thanks for joining us for this discussion about Hong Kong's democracy movement. This is quite a personal discussion for me. I lived in Hong Kong for 4 years, between 2015 and 2019, which was a period of quite significant change, but presaged even more kind of radical change in the years afterwards. I wrote my first book about Hong Kong, about young people and identity, which did feature Nathan Law, who's one of our panelists. Obviously, since I left, in the aftermath of the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, the Chinese government has cracked down hard on the city's once vibrant democracy movement. More than 1,000 Hong Kongers have been prosecuted or jailed for their activism or their role in the protests. Almost every single prominent pro-democracy politician is in jail, on trial, or in exile, including Nathan and Carmen, who I'll introduce shortly. Nearly 150,000 Hong Kongers have moved out to the UK alone in the last 2 years. And I think it's fair to say that the Chinese government, the party, Communist Party and the government have eradicated any semblance of democratic choice in Hong Kong's elections. They've introduced a sweeping national security law and established big outposts for China's secret police in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong may still have two systems on the surface, but it has little freedom or autonomy these days. I'm joined tonight by three insightful speakers to discuss the troubling outlook for Hong Kong's democracy movement and hopefully to talk about some ways forward. So to my left, we have Carmen Lau, who's a former district councillor in exile in London with various charges against her, but not as many charges as Nathan Law, sitting next to Carmen, who was a member of Hong Kong's Legislative Council briefly before he was disqualified, also in exile in the UK. And at the end, we have Jeff Wasserstrom, who's a professor of modern Chinese history at the University of California, Irvine, not in exile in London, but doing a visiting professorship, I think, at Birkbeck University, which is probably a cushier gig, I think it's fair to say. This discussion is going to be on the record. It's being live streamed, I think, on Zoom. If you are watching on Zoom, we're happy to take your questions, so please ask them using the Q&A function. We'll get to your questions in the room as well later on. For now, we will crack on. The first question I have is quite a big one, but an important one, which is what's the biggest challenge facing the democracy movement right now in Hong Kong? And I might come to you first, Carmen.
Well, thank you for Ben's introduction. The biggest challenge in Hong Kong for now is that, of course, obviously, is the national security law, because after national security law is literally no protesters or even no dissident voice are allowed in Hong Kong or even overseas. And that's for the reason why so many Hong Kongers fled Hong Kong. Not only those who had actively involved in the political sphere in Hong Kong, but also just ordinary citizens and education system and legal system are cracked down. There are more and more political prisoners are now in jail in Hong Kong, not only under national security law, but many of the other charges. And yeah, for now, as of yesterday, we have a statistic that there's 1,491 political prisoners in Hong Kong, after which was charged after the movement. And obviously, 85 civil society organizations were disbanded after the national security law.
So it's not just about the individuals, it's the organizations as well. And Nathan, what's the state of play? So are there new trials and new charges still coming out? Is this all sort of historic cases related to the 2019 protests, or are there new charges that activists are facing these days?
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Ben, and very lovely to meet you again, Jeff and common. So obviously, like Chatham House rule does not apply, right? This is open discussion. This is always my favorite joke, like going into institutes that a specific rule that's named after it. It's so interesting. But anyway, Chatham House, we've crossed our path many times, and very lovely to be here again. Definitely, I think Carmen laid out lots of challenges that we face in Hong Kong, including there are just new prosecutions coming out in recent days that they press charges on protesters after 4 years, and those charges disrupt their lives, and they could face years of imprisonment. We're talking about more than a dozen of them, just freshly pressed charge a few days ago, and we've got more than 1,000 political prisoners. All these prominent figures like Jimmy Lai, Benny Tai, Joshua Wong, that they are all in jails. Many of them, they've been in jail for more than 2 years without knowing a verdict. And people like Jimmy Lai, who is aged 70, could be in prison for life. Those are the future that they're facing. So the situation is really difficult and depressing. And of course, challenges do not only come from inside the city. We've also seen kind of like warming relationship with China, the international pressure putting on them, dropping. We heard that really staggering comment from President Macron. And we've seen investment minister of the UK sending to Hong Kong saying that, oh, I'm so happy to be in Hong Kong, pretending everything is normal. I think those are bad signals for us as democratic activists trying to put pressure to the regime and also raising awareness for Hong Kong. So I think that there are lots of layers and different votes in the challenges that we face. And as an exile activist in the UK, of course, there's another aspect, which is how we can establish a new civil society in the UK, as we've got more than 160,000 Hong Kong people come in these few years, and how we interact with the local civil society, how we continue to campaign for Hong Kong. I think these are also challenges that we are facing.
And I'm sure for both of you, you've got quite a few friends and colleagues who've been jailed. I mean, at a personal level, how are people doing in these kinds of conditions?
Well, it really depends. We've seen some of them being really strong, like they are just standing in the courtroom saying that I will not bend my knees to you. I will say what I want and I will defend it. Like you've got Gwyneth Ho, you've got Chow Hun Tong. They're also really strong in facing those trials. They don't really care about how many years that they're being sent. They just want to make the case. And we've got some also other defendants who will take a more pragmatic approach, pleading guilty not because they believe that they've done something wrong. They clearly understand that the court has been tilted towards the government. It has become part of the persecution. So pleading guilty could be a strategy for them to reduce their sentencing and to get out of jail as early as possible. And for some, they are mentally depressed. They're separated from loved one for years. For me, it's already tough. Like I cannot see my family because they are in Hong Kong. But for them, they couldn't even have like regular conversation with them, or some of them they cannot like kind of touch their kids and kind of have intimate interaction. So I think that's also what made some of them like in a terrible mental state there.
Yeah. As an exiled activist, it's been really hard for like us to resettle in a new country and to try to familiarize with a new community. But for those who are in jail or in prison, it's just you can't imagine how hard they've been, not only mentally but physically. How the weather in Hong Kong is like. So like for today, for example, it's been 34 degrees Celsius in Hong Kong. So there's no air conditioning, and the condition of the jail in Hong Kong is really worse. So it's been like a mental torture for them to being kept for so long.
And Nathan, I think as you were alluding to, people face a very invidious choice in a way, because if they kind of plead not guilty, they have to fight out a long case, and then there's a sense that they're not going to get a fair hearing anyway. I mean, Jeff, what would your view be? Do you think people can expect sort of a fair trial and fair legal process these days in Hong Kong anymore?
I don't think they can expect a fair trial, and I think it's one of the things that can't be stressed enough, that Hong Kong never had democracy. It didn't have democracy under the British control. It didn't have democracy under PRC control. But it did have some division of powers, which I think was something that was very important, a sense that courts were operating differently than they did on the mainland, and that the courts could operate differently than the police wanted them to operate or than the government wanted them to operate. And so I think, we have a tendency to talk about democracy and we think of elections. But certainly as an American, I've become painfully aware of how important separation of powers is to any kind of part of democracy. And I think this is something just crucial to keep in mind, that there was a time when you would have people arrested. I remember during Umbrella Movement, as somebody who was more used to tracking protests on the mainland, people would be arrested and then they'd be out on bail right afterwards talking to the press. And you'd say, like, okay, the arrest might not have been that different, but what happened right after it would be. But I'm so glad you're putting attention on this, to have this event, and to be able to share a stage with these people and hear these powerful stories, because I do think there's been something insidious about the way in which Hong Kong has been attacked by Beijing, which has been by a process of kind of slow strangulation, rather than one simple moment that the world was kind of bracing for, in which you'd have violence and bodies on the street. And this is very invidious, but I think that you've gotten a sense of how we just shouldn't look away. It's also important to know that it's both the national security law, but they're also using other laws, including leftover British sedition laws. So it's using these different things to make the story a harder one to follow, to allow kind of room for people to say, well, wasn't it just as bad in other times? So it's a very complicated story, but that's all the more reason why I think you'd be commended for having this kind of event.
I don't know if it's polite to ask people about their criminal charges during an event, but I'll do it anyway, because I think
I don't have any at the moment.
I know, not talking about you yet, Jeff, but I think it goes to this point, because I think, Carmen, you're facing a charge for sort of persuading people not to vote. Is that right?
Yeah, during last year legislative council elections, yes. It happens after I arrived in the UK. Yeah, and I think it's also a tactic for the Hong Kong government to use non-national security charges to charge over people, because talking about transnational repression or the extradition relationship is easier to convince other countries to extradite maybe some of the Hong Kong citizens other than national security, not under national security law charges. So it's the tactics for them to do so, and it gets less focus on those charges as well.
And does that make it difficult for you when you're thinking about your travel plans for your work or in your personal life? Do these kinds of charges mean you have to worry about where you go?
Well, for me, definitely, I'm a refugee in the UK, so I'm holding a refugee travel document, and there are a lot of restrictions on these documents and a lot of visa process you have to been through, a lot of vetting, so definitely inconvenience. But yeah, following what Carmen has just said, I think we've seen all these tactics of prosecuting dissidents with tax evasion, or some of the non-political charges, so to stigmatize them and possibly to extradite them. But we also have been seeing a lot of these charges being put on some activists in Hong Kong, which is using some of the decades-old colonial law that have never been used after 1960s, 1970s. Like those conspiracy law, we've got a very new case about those child book publishers that are being charged by conspiracy to publish seditious publications, which as long as the government, considering the things that you publish or you say, can intrigue hatred to the government, which is a vaguely defined term, then you could be submitted to years of imprisonment. Like, just to imagine if you are a child book writer, you want to write something just look like 1984, anything like this, you could definitely face years of imprisonment, and that's the reality of Hong Kong. So for me, I faced charges on attending illegal assembly on June 4th vigil, same charge as Carmen, some of the national security law charges. I served jail sentencing because my involvement in 2014 umbrella movement, because of peaceful protesting. And from my also personal experience, you could really see the decline of Hong Kong's judicial system and the rights of people. Like, at my time when I served jail sentencing, it was 2016, 2017. And when people talk about like being charged with attending or organizing or inciting unlawful assemblies, we were talking about if it is like prison sentencing, it would be a big news. Like, it would be a big blow to the civil society, because we used to think that like attending a peaceful assembly without government's permit is our right, and even though I break the rules, the punishment would be, as I served also, community service, which is much lighter than jail term. But if we're talking about the charges that we've seen for the past 2 to 3 years, just attending like illegal assembly, it could be up to a year, and then riot, it could be 3 to 5 years, and then for now, national security law, we don't know how long it would be. There are some speculations about some of the mastermind of protests, as Beijing described, like Jimmy Lai, Benny Tai, they could be there up to a decade. So that is also a reflection of how the system has lost its division of power, been manipulated, and those weaponization of the legal system just getting worse and worse.
And Jeff, I mean, are you surprised by how quickly this has happened?
I'm surprised by how quickly some things have happened and how slowly some other things have happened. And I think getting back to that, it's part of, I think, a strategy to not have the world's focus stay on Hong Kong the way it might have. I mean, just the slowness was that right after the national security law came in, they didn't take all the statues down related to Tiananmen. That was one of the things that was different about Hong Kong. They waited till that was a totally different news cycle than a set of arrests. They went after different groups of civil society in different news cycles, different months, different multiple months. So I think it's important to think about how radically different Hong Kong is now than it was a mere 5 years ago, when, for example, in the middle of the big protests of 2019, they let Joshua Wong out of prison early for good behavior. I think it was. But simply, that would be the kind of thing where on the mainland, if there was somebody who you thought might be a troublemaker during a difficult time, you would keep them in jail for an added time. They'd let them out. And now that's just unthinkable. But on the other hand, it's interesting how kind of syncopated and delayed some of the moves were in parts that you would allow attention to shift to other things. And I guess it was confidence that the world would have other crises that would pull people's attention away. If you were talking about repression in Hong Kong and then the coup in Burma happens and you have things that are so horrific on your screens right away, and then a year later, the invasion of Ukraine. So it has been both a slow story and a fast story.
And if I could ask Carmen and then Nathan, I mean, how are you both adjusting to life in the UK?
It's a really challenging question. Yeah, I've been here since July 2021. And at first, because I came here alone, like many of the other Hong Kongers, at first it was quite a hard time for me because I made that decision within a really short period of time. And I've never been to the UK, and I just know some people here, 2 or 3 people here in the UK. And it took me some time to get familiarized with the whole environment and the community here. But I think when time goes and more Hong Kongers came here through the BNO visa scheme, and it is it's been really great to see that we could see a vibrant Hong Kong or civil society rebuild, reconstruct here in the UK. And many of them are actually, they may not be, they may have never been involved in the civil society in Hong Kong, but they started to try to do something here in the UK. And it's really happy and glad to see that.
Yeah, I think my experience has been, in general, quite positive. I think I'm really fortunate to be able to leave Hong Kong, as many of my fellows were unable to do so. And I'm a person who is not easily affected by weather, so otherwise I would be more grumpy than I am now, definitely. But yeah, I think it gives a very good opportunity for us to continue our international advocacy work, just like what I've been doing before I came to the UK. And we've got a growing community, and even though there are a lot more civil society groups in Hong Kong, from Hong Kong in the UK has been born and has been active, there are also a lot of works that we have to do to overcome all those challenges. And I am really glad that I still have that position to be able to speak up for Hong Kong people and to work for them and to kind of raise awareness on the human rights abuses. So I think that's mostly what gives people motivation to live, right? Like you have a sense of purpose, you have a purpose of life. And for me, being transitioned from as a Hong Kong politician / activist to be here as an exile activist, international advocate for Hong Kong, that transition was quite smooth, and I still could kind of perform my vocation even though I'm not in my homeland. So I'm really grateful and fortunate. But on the other hand, we've also got a lot of challenges faced, especially trying to deepen the understanding of Hong Kong and the dynamics of Hong Kong, China, and the transnational aggression and persecution of the Chinese regime. So freshly, we just had an incident that a church in Guildford just cancelled an event organized by Hong Kong community, and that was an event about the children's book that I mentioned. Basically, the church is saying that, and I interpret as they received complaints about the book, and they thought that it was sensitive. They thought that it could be kind of doing a bad reputation to PRC, and then they cancelled the event, refusing to lend those community groups to use the church as a way to read the book and to interact. And I think that is a clear evidence of how much we still need to do to address those issues, because like Beijing spread their propaganda overseas, and they are not only using the media outlet, but they also use the kind of hyper-nationalistic nationals overseas to do things like this. I'm sure that there were calls made by like Chinese embassy or even these Chinese nationals to tell the church not to give the sites out for those really community-based events. And maybe the church doesn't understand the dynamics. Maybe they didn't understand these like transnational oppression could take place in those forms. And that is where we come in and we start the dialogue, saying that like we're not entreating hatred by reading these children's book. We're trying to preserve our identity. We're trying to teach our next generations, especially those who were born and raised in this country, about our history. And the diversity of identity and diversity of culture is what we value and what we treasure. And if you give in to these intimidation and aggression from the Chinese regime, you're basically damaging one of the core values that our community share and our society share, which is you respect people's differences and you respect diversity. And I think like, I don't mean to say that the church made a bad decision. I think it's a bad decision, but I think it's also because that there's no discussion about it. Like they just don't have that awareness. So I think this is definitely a good time to start that discussion, to basically to stand out and defend the rights of us to preserve our history and to preserve all those things that define us.
Well, I didn't think we'd get to Guildford in the discussion, but good to know. I mean, obviously, beyond the 150-odd thousand Hong Kongers who've moved to the UK, there's been probably thousands who've moved to other places, Australia, Taiwan, Canada, the US, other places in Europe. Jeff, I mean, I want to ask you, do you think from the Communist Party's perspective, this is sort of a good thing? That the troublemakers in their eyes, or the people who are not patriots, who are not loyal, that have left Hong Kong, and that's a positive thing? And are there lessons we can learn from kind of earlier periods of sort of exile and expatriation, when maybe around following the Tiananmen Square massacres, or even in sort of the early 20th century, when we've seen the things that can happen? Is this kind of a worrying sign for the Chinese government? Is it good?
That's a really interesting way to put it. I think there's always been a mixed feeling about whether it's just good to get people out, and in China there have been troublemakers who, in the views of the Communist Party, are troublemakers who have been allowed to leave, and then they've seen them become much less relevant once gone. But there are other times when they try to hold people very tightly, so it can go in two different directions. Thinking about parallels from the past, I was listening to a lot of this, and it's not the first time. I've been thinking about Tibet a lot, because I do think that the Beijing's playbook towards some of the things, even the church event that Nathan was just talking about, is part of a Tibet playbook, and different ways of trying to marginalize and to put pressure on things. And the pressure can be in quite subtle kinds of symbolic ways. There was an American university that shall remain nameless that was going to have the Dalai Lama come and speak, and a request was put that they not have him speak, and the university said, of course he will. They said, well, can you not have him have a photograph taken with the head of the university? Just have the deputy head. And the university said, okay. And there are these sort of testings of the water back and forth that go on that way. Certainly the idea of keeping alive a culture when you're outside of the physical place where it flourished, that's something that, that is a kind of something that has come from Tibet. And there is a whole history of thinking of Tibet and Hong Kong. Tibet was offered something somewhat like the one country, two systems deal in 1950, and it seemed to go okay for a time, and then pressure came up. The center got more grasping, resistance got stronger, and you can read about this in many books, including Isabel Hilton's, in which you had this kind of parallel. And there was even a time when the Dalai Lama thought this could work, and then there was a time when it clearly couldn't work. And there were some people in Hong Kong who thought in the 80s that this was something that really should be paid attention to. There were others who didn't think about it, who thought Hong Kong would be different, that Hong Kongers were not ethnically different, and that this wouldn't be the same. But I think we've seen something with differences of a kind of related parallel. And so I have noticed among Hong Kongers in exile I've talked to, there's a lot of interest now in the Tibetan case, and sometimes even some self-reflection about not having paid more attention to that kind of situation earlier. And a good way of sort of crystallizing this was there were protests largely involving Tibetans before the 2008 Olympics. And there was a skillful playing of things by Beijing in the 2008 Olympics, with some events even being able to, equestrian events being held in Hong Kong, and some sense of this being a China's Olympics. By 2022, one of the most dramatic protests was Joey Siu, a Hong Konger in exile, worked together with a Tibetan to hang a banner on the scaffolding outside of the Acropolis, and they joined together to think about that. So that was an interesting moment, and also showing some of the potential for solidarity, new kinds of solidarities emerging among exiles who start to feel things in common. And that's something we've seen in the past, both with people from the same place and also from people from different places involved in anti-colonial movements who see something of a kindred effort in what's going on.
So given all the restrictions, Carmen, given kind of the national security law and its the fact that it applies globally, I mean, what can you do, from the UK? What's the space? How do you stay relevant to people back in Hong Kong? How much do you try to influence kind of the political environment and the debate in the UK? What sorts of things are you working on?
I think there are at least two directions of work that we can do, not only for activists, but also like Hong Kongers here in the UK can do. Is like just echo what Jeff has said. I think there are more and more collaborations and connections between not only like groups that are suppressed by the Chinese regime, but also from all around the world who are being oppressed by authoritarian regimes. I think people are starting to get together, not just to show solidarity, but to learn from each other and to campaign together, like campaign for political prisoners around the world, and to protest for the countries that still have economic relationship with those authoritarian regimes. And I think this is on the level of international communities. But for people in the UK, because I think we found that the Hong Kong government is trying to isolate people in Hong Kong from other parts of the world. And not only to like constrain what they can receive from the media, but also to make them silent, and also to cut the connections between friends and family from Hong Kong. So I think one thing that people, especially in the UK, for Hong Kongers in the UK to do is that to keep really close and to stay really updated for news in Hong Kong, because we still have small rooms for like online media to survive in Hong Kong, and we can still have independent bookstores. We can still have some concern groups that focuses on specific policies in Hong Kong. And I think people in the UK, Hong Kongers in the UK here, can still like getting really updated to these issues and to try to spread the words for the people in Hong Kong, and to not let them to be too separated from the rest of the world. And this is what the Hong Kong government is trying to do, the Chinese regime is trying to do, and we should break through the barriers and to keep connected with those people who are still in Hong Kong.
And Nathan, just expanding on that, I mean, do you think there can really be a Hong Kong democracy movement anymore? In a way, isn't your fate just completely bound up with what happens in China?
Well, definitely, it is a very dynamic situation, right? We cannot also say that like politics don't change in mainland China, politics don't change in Chinese Communist Party as they face so many difficulties. So I would rather say it is a dynamic situation and we're in the low point of the history, but it will bounce back. For people who are living overseas, that's part of our duties to try to think about how we can vitalize and how we can support that when the opportunity comes. Other than those international political advocacy work, I would also think that cultural work is really important. We've seen a systematic cultural cleansing work that been doing for decades in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and things like this started to popping out in Hong Kong as the government have been actively trying to rewrite history. They've banned all the movies that are about the protest. They've censored all the songs, all the artists and singers who are kind of sympathetic to the movement. They were banned to have any concerts. So we were also seeing a cultural cleansing in Hong Kong just at a very initial stage. And that's the reason why I found an NGO called Hong Kong Umbrella Community. Is a non-profit NGO that we have already hosted 2 film festivals in the UK that we bring all those movies that are banned from Hong Kong, and we kind of like demonstrate the history of the 2019 protest movement and other rather sensitive films to the government. And we've also organized a cultural festival called Hong Kong March. In this March, we've got more than 50 local Hong Kong stores partnering with more than 20 community groups across the UK, and we throw more than 50 cultural activities in the whole month of March. And that's a really good way to introduce who we are, our identity, our culture, and to preserve that, as the regime is definitely afraid of our identity, uniqueness, and the culture that we represent. And I think that's a really important work that we've been doing. Every time when I saw Notting Hill Festival, all those festivals that represent a generation, represent a specific group of people, I would love to see something like this from the Hong Kong community to be popping out in the UK. And whenever those festivals come out, it will appear on BBC headlines, it will appear on every news outline, and that like we are here and we want to contribute and we are sharing our culture with you. So that's the ultimate goal. But also one of the challenges that we face is also about Chinese influence in this country, in this atmosphere, that for NGOs like this, it is almost impossible to get any collaboration with business groups. Even though they are British companies, they are also worried about those malign Chinese influence, even though we've done magnificent work. When we reach out to private foundations, we reach out to business groups, the answers are quite clear. So that's also a challenge that we face, how we can also get the resources to do what we can do under this kind of economic coercion, or even to a certain extent a blackmailing of the Chinese influence.
And is there anything that the British and other allied and friendly governments can do? I mean, if you look at the outcome of the G7 meeting in Japan, there seemed to be this kind of cohesion between the G7 countries about China policy, but do you think that they have any influence over what happens in Hong Kong anymore? I mean, it seemed to me maybe they once did at a time when they didn't really care, but now it seems hard to imagine what the British government, the US government can do. But do you still see opportunity in lobbying Western governments that can impact what happens in Hong Kong?
Well, I think for now, there are lots of disconnection and it's not quite consistent. It is almost like a disarray of attitude when some of the European countries, they wanted to move closer to China, while some of the others still maintaining a really strong rhetoric. And I think that is definitely not healthy, but we can also understand that some of these global leaders, they think that they have to prioritize resources on Russia, so that they must have to warm their relationship with China in that way. Of course, we kind of understand the logic behind it, but the reality is the situation in Hong Kong is never getting any better. It's stagnated. It's kind of like a calm surface, but the undercurrent has been going worse and worse. You don't see many news in Western media, in the media in the UK, because there are no big scenes of protesting, there are no big scenes of people marching down to the street, but there are more and more political persecution when the day goes by, and sentencings are getting more and more serious. And under that circumstance, like, we have a government that are sending the delegation to the cities. Like, that was literally the first delegation ministerial visit since 2018. When things got worse. And because there are no news, so that they think that they can re-establish those connections. And I think that is just saying that we don't care anymore. Like, we don't care about your political persecution. We want to do business with you. And I think that is an absolutely troubling attitude that we have. So I think at least we should keep our attention on it. We should be more understanding of the human rights situation there, and craft our foreign policy more tilted towards preserving those values and human rights, rather than just pretending no one cares and they just do normal business with them.
Obviously, in Asia overall, on the surface, it's been a pretty sort of bad decade for democracy, and people talk about this global sort of democratic recession or democratic backsliding. But I guess one thing I've seen in a number of countries is a lot of young people, in particular in Hong Kong, in Myanmar, in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, willing to make a lot of personal sacrifices for democracy, for their freedoms. And I know, Jeff, you've been doing some work on this and the sort of so-called milk tea alliance, some of these kind of nascent connections between groups. But is there something there beyond kind of emojis on social media? Because it seems to me, if you're a democracy activist in Hong Kong or Myanmar, Thailand, you've got enough to worry about on your own patch without worrying about other people's struggles. So yeah, beyond the kind of the social media memes and the kind of media stories, have you found that there is something thicker there in these relationships between young people struggling for democracy across Asia?
So I think there's not something there in the way that I think we're used to looking for, sort of formal institutional things, and even the term alliance suggests something more solid. But I do think that the expressions of solidarity among different groups, things that keep hope alive in different ways, can be really important. And it's important, there's almost like a sense of a baton being passed to different places where the struggle gets particularly intense. There were moments in 2014, there was a very dark moment in Thailand with the coup. And one thing that kept some hope alive for some Thai youth who were involved in that was to look at Hong Kong with the umbrella movement and to think about what was being done there, and then the forming of a new political party, Democistas. And now you could imagine in a similar way, thinking about the results in the Thai election, even though it's unclear what will happen, there seems to be a broad consensus of one thing, that the election went the direction it did, in part because of what young people did in taking a sort of seemingly impossible kind of set of actions in 2020. And so this is something where I think I expected working on the Milk Tea Alliance and working on youth activists and talking to exiles to be a much more depressing kind of project, but it's actually been quite inspiring to talk to them. And it's not an issue of just for Asia, by the way. These are often young people who are saying, in a sense, an older generation have messed up our chances for the world we're going to live in. So there is a kind of echoing of climate strike activism too, and there too, I think mutual solidarity is not something that should be taken too lightly, even if it isn't thick and substantial and institutional.
And on that point, Carmen, I mean, what gives you hope in terms of the struggle for democracy as you look at sort of around the world? Are there other places or people that give you kind of hope to carry on the cause?
Yeah, I would say I've recently, I've attended some of the kind of like international activist gathering, and it really not only to show solidarity for an alliance or maybe some kind of association between, among activists, but we kind of like learning from each other. We learn from Taiwan student movement, and for now after 2019, and not only people from the Asia region learn from the Hong Kong movement, but also like from the South America, they just brought maybe some kind of strategy that we got from the Hong Kong movements to their places. And I think we are getting closer and closer, as we know that the authoritarian regime or the autocracies, they actually help each other and learn from each other as well. So it's always essential for us to know what each of us are doing. And at the moment, maybe we don't have too many substantial campaigns or projects working together, but I think from time to time we will go to that path, and to show regimes around the world, to show the international community that we do need attention. All the countries who are suppressed by authoritarian regimes need attention and need some substantial, assertive actions to help us. Yeah.
I'm going to come to questions in the room in a sec, but just one question online first from Michael Moe, who I think is another former district councillor in exile in the UK. There's probably form a full parliament once you all group together. But he wants to ask about the Hong Kong diaspora community in the UK, and maybe Nathan, you might want to take this one first. But how can you make the Hong Kong diaspora more united? Because it's apparent that the community is fragmented, and a lack of synergy could make Hong Kongers miss the political opportunity in future, particularly with elections coming up in the UK and BNO and passport holders who are resident here can vote in UK elections.
Well, yeah, the election is a big issue, and for us, our community has been paying attention to the China policy that we're waiting for it to be rolled out. So that's definitely a big issue. I think we are relatively newborn in this in this country, and many of us are still navigating our ways in these very complicated social and governmental system, how we can register as a community interest group, how we can register as a charity, how we can get funding, how we can work together. So I think that there are a lot of things definitely we have to learn. But one thing that I think that can definitely unite us is that we agree we should form networks, that we should support each other, and we should definitely preserve our identity and our values. We've seen a lot of organizations working together now, no matter it's hosting rallies, hosting community events, cultural events. I think by understanding each other a bit more in collaboration and also forming these network way of connecting, those are a really good thing for us to start with.
All right, if you have any questions in the room, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. We'll start over there at the back. Yeah. And please tell us who you are and if you have any affiliation.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Nadeau, member of Chatham House by way of Los Angeles, California go. You mentioned traditional diplomatic approaches to Hong Kong in terms of world leaders coming and visiting and things that we need to think about. I wonder what the panel thinks about soft power diplomacy and how we can leverage using trade, education, cultural exchange. How do we leverage soft power diplomacy to encourage, more open society in Hong Kong?
Well, maybe I can come into the question and then supplement it by the other guesses. I think, the problem that concerns me is not about how we can utilize our soft power, it's how we can blunt China's ones. Because we've seen a lot of incidents that China, they repackage their propaganda into beautiful terms and into soft power and export it to Western countries, and then people fall into their lies. Like, for example, there was a time when I had a advocacy visit to one of one of the European country, and when I turned on the television, it was CCTV. They basically pay a bunch of hotels to ask them to set CCTV as their default television. And we've got like Confucius Institutes like really doing a lot of these soft power propaganda work for Beijing. And our community has been really concerned about it. And we've been raising a lot of questions about how we can blunt these propaganda and these extended arm of the CCP to try to neutralize criticism to them. So I think that's what I think for our community we're more concerned with.
Okay, at the front.
Mr. Hakim from Politics with Hakim. My question is, to what extent Hong Kong people rely on the West and the US to stand by them, uplifting democratic values? Because in Afghanistan, the Afghans stand shoulder to shoulder with the West, but were left alone, and the girls do not have access to basic education. The fact now that many refugees are not even welcome, their life are still in limbo in the US and in the West as well. So my concern is about navigating the future of democracy is the West actively or supporting the democratic values, or they're just doing it cosmetically to show that we are very much loyal to the democracy? So that's my question, are they uplifting the democratic values in real terms, or is it the same case maybe we see Hong Kong after 20 years, the same as in Afghanistan, is left with Taliban? Thank you.
Maybe I can also come into a story. So in 2014, when I was a student leader in the umbrella movement, we got so little international support and attention, just because the Obama administration had been really close to China. The other parts of the world have been seeing China as close partners, even though the UK, there was a term called golden era coins. Well, as a young student leader at that moment, we were quite frustrated about how the world reacted to the situation of Hong Kong. But that is the reality. Like sometimes countries, they take their foreign policy aligning with their interest. We're of course frustrated about it. But as a movement that is fully supported by Hong Kong people, there are so many pool data and election results showing that the majority of Hong Kong people supporting the movement. We get as much support as we can get. We criticize the government if they are trying to please China just for commercial values, interest, and take no consideration on human rights and their attack to our values. But at the end of the day, it is our movement, and we get support as much as we can. And I think that is the way that we can unite people, not only in the UK, in the US, but unite people in Myanmar, in Thai, in Afghanistan, in Iran, that we can form a global movement that we can really counter the international global backsliding of democracy. And that's the best that we can do.
If I may. Yeah, I do really understand the feeling that you get annoyed when you see those Western democratic powers support democratic values, on the other hand, shaking hands with the autocracies for financial and economic interests. And this is also a question or a challenge that the Hong Kong diaspora groups are facing at the moment, because we understand that to sustain our movement or our beliefs is we cannot rely on any powers or any countries, any Western country forever. So that's why I think that it's important for oppressed groups to work together and to try to figure out a way that's how it could be like to keep the sustainability of our movements to move on. And it's easy to be forgotten as there's loss happening in the globe day by day. And well, I do really understand that feeling. And yeah, but what we can do is we have to try and to keep the issue on the table. And yeah, that's what another thing that the Western countries should be aware of as well, is that it doesn't really make sense for them to protect those people who strive for democratic values, but on the other hand, they keep some kind of economical interest with those countries that are actually, in fact, suppressing the people there.
I would just add one thing, is that it's important to not completely separate out the stories of what the West is doing and what China is doing or other authoritarian regimes. And here we haven't brought up Xinjiang, but I think the most recent writing on Xinjiang, some of the most important works, Darren Byler's work is one, talks very much about the complicity of Western providers of surveillance technology in the story of what's been happening in Xinjiang and the suppression of the Uyghurs. There's been talk about how the discourse of the war on terror helped to make some of the moves there more palatable. In the Hong Kong case, it wasn't accidental that a new national security law was going to come in 2003, right after the Patriot Act had come in the United States. So these are intertwined stories. It was actually very inspiring in 2003 to see Hong Kong people push back against that proposed law more than there was in the United States against the Patriot Act. But I think these are entwined stories, so it's not just separate things. But that doesn't mean that we can't be particularly critical of particular grotesque human rights abuses.
Question at the back, gentlemen.
Thanks, Ben. I'm Douglas Wong. I had the privilege of living in Hong Kong for 18 years. I knew Ben there. If I could ask Nathan and Carmen, as activists, as Jeff said earlier, Hong Kong's a radically different place than it was 5 years ago. And it has lost many of the freedoms that most of us here would recognize, and seen a redefinition of democracy and judicial independence. As activists, as young politicians who were obviously fighting for a Hong Kong that actually had the opposite and achieved democratic values rather than the loss of the democratic values. In retrospect, is there anything different that either of you would have done?
Well, it's definitely a question I got asked quite often, and thank you for your question. For me, I think as a student leader in 2014, there was definitely a lot of more communication and connection with the people protesting that could take place. But in 2019, I think one thing that we have to understand that is protest has all, like in Hong Kong, it was a really spontaneous event, and it was difficult to plan ahead. I really remember in June, early June 2019, it was just a few days before the big protest. We were talking about the figure of how many people would come out. 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. Some optimistic ones were saying 500,000, but turns out we got 1 million. And turns out there were scuffles, there were people escalating the actions, which were really out of our expectation. As a small particle in such a big event, what we can do is just to be our part and to explain what is happening in that atmosphere of the world and to the rest of the world. So my part there was quite clear. I was almost like a megaphone of Hong Kong. I'm a translator of what is happening. And my duty is to talk to international media, talk to policymakers, and have them a better understanding what is happening in Hong Kong. So I would pretty much feel like there are a lot more that we can do. There are a lot more parties that we can find. But at the end of the day, if we want to have a retrospect understanding or kind of thinking out an alternative way of how protests spawn, I think it's really difficult because it's so organic and it's so spontaneous. But I would rather agree on one point, which is the movement, the power balance was really, really not there. Like Beijing had so much power that Hong Kong people were unable to have effective resistance. Some would argue that if we waited 5 years, 10 years, would it be better because China would be in a worse stage in terms of economic power, global influence? That could be a philosophical question, but that is definitely not a realistic one for us to consider.
Well, well, I think lots of us share the same feeling that it's a spontaneous movement. And there's one really specific character of the movement in 2019 is decentralization. Well, because during that time I worked for a legislator, and no one could ever imagine that these kind of protests would have happened. And even the legislator, what they was doing or what they reacted was actually driven by the crowd, by every participant of the movement. So yeah, the whole thing was actually like it's interesting to talk about it because now because it's like talking about someone else's stories. But yeah, for me, it was like a dream. Well, those trigger points, and when you saw so many Hong Kongers rallies or protests on the street, and yeah, every one of us could like easily find a position for each of us. Some may drive to gather the protesters together, or like our legislator, they do their own thing in the legislative council, obviously. And yeah, I think we couldn't like say how could it be to have a different ending, and or if we do something else, maybe we can go to the path that we wanted to be. And actually some may say that what happened now in Hong Kong is actually what for some of the participants of the movement had foreseen. This is a transition period to making China accountable to their human rights repression. So it's really couldn't tell because it's a really decentralized movement.
Next question I'll take from online, from Cha Yu Liang. What's the prospect of this Chinese Communist Party's efforts to indoctrinate the next generation of Hong Kongers? Jeff, maybe you might have a view, because I guess after Tiananmen, there was a movement in the mainland.
Sure, patriotic education, and the first, well, one of the big movements was a pushback against patriotic education in 2012. That then, ironically, exactly a decade later, there's patriotic education brought in. But here I think it's really useful to think about what happened on the mainland in November last year, the white paper protest, by a generation that was really widely thought of to be brainwashed and to be hyper-nationalistic. And certainly there are people within that generation who are, but there was something quite striking about that, and the support for what was going on there among some students abroad. I think we've had an ongoing tendency to overestimate the way in which youth will be anti-regime, but we've also had a tendency to underestimate the way in which some degree of critical thinking can stay there under the surface in ways as well.
Okay, I'll just take one more in the room, Isabel. Yeah, it's coming.
Thank you so much. Given how jealously the legal establishment in Hong Kong fought or guarded its judicial independence, the beginnings of the suggestions of the extradition law and so on, they were conspicuously joining the protests in the marches. Do you find it surprising how easily it seems the regime has managed to subvert that? And now we're seeing, this is a legal system which involves British judges, British barristers, and yet it's become an instrument of state coercion, apparently relatively easily.
I think this is a great question. There are a few incidents that I can correlate to your question. First of all, one of the most senior democratic parties in Hong Kong was just disbanded. The name is Civil Party. It was founded by a few very well-esteemed legal professionals, like lawyers, QC cases, and it's disbanded because of they just don't see a way out in Hong Kong's politics. So that was seen as kind of a cornerstone of the kind of understanding that rule of law could defend Hong Kong, faded and died in the middle of that. And we can also see one case about Jimmy Lai. The request of Jimmy Lai hiring a British barrister was refused, and the court did not stop the government from doing that. There are just so many these cases showing that the courts has been compromised when they foresee that if they've done something wrong, then they would receive repercussion, because Beijing, but let's not forget Beijing has the right to interpret Hong Kong's constitution, which is so different from what we have here or in the US or in some more advanced countries where courts explain constitutions. That's not the case in Hong Kong. Our constitution is being explained by a bunch of Chinese Communist Party members in NPCSC, and they judge it through their political interest. So on the one hand, we could say that, yes, there could be a lot of infiltration in Hong Kong's legal judicial system. But on the other hand, we've also got that pressure from these judges. They would automatically think that, oh, if I gave a wrong judgment in Beijing's term, will they just reinterpret? And at the end of the day, I still have to give a harsher sentence. There is a self-censorship. There's a kind of a recalibration in the whole legal system just because Beijing utilize and abuse the tool of interpretation. So I would guess there are many different folds of how Hong Kong's judicial system gets to be less and less independent, and there are many causes of it. But I think there's one thing that we cannot argue, which is we're definitely seeing the judicial system of Hong Kong becoming the tool of the government and to become weaponized and suppressing the protest.
Talking about the Civic Party, I was honored to be served it within as a Civic Party district councillor back in Hong Kong. And, but I mean, in my observation, I think that it's not an incident that happens really quickly after the national security law to crack down the legal system in Hong Kong or the rule of law in Hong Kong. Because you can see that in like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the Hong Kong government and also the Chinese government, they started to dilute the circle of the legal system in Hong Kong. And from time to time, there were more and more Chinese lawyers that they could practice in Hong Kong. And obviously, Hong Kong lawyers and barristers, many of them actually, they have business with some of the Chinese business or investor companies. And I think it's a gradual pathway to lead to this kind of crackdown. And I've heard sometimes in the UK that even the UK barristers and lawyers, they have connections or they have business with China or Chinese company. They would keep silence on the issue of Hong Kong and also obviously, of course, China. And once I've heard there were multiple cases that lawyers from a barristers from a chamber that really outspoken for Hong Kong or for national security law issues, they find out that, well, other members of the chambers, they spoke out for Hong Kong rule of law issues, they just quit the chamber. So it's not, I think it's not a one-day issue to make this happen, but it's like, I think the Chinese government, the Hong Kong government have been like planning this for so long. Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time for tonight, but thanks so much to everyone for coming, and thanks to everyone who joined us online. And please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists.